So here we are with our fourth session of the day, Player Management and Scope of Sports Law, which will be moderated by Divya Sayani, a master's student of Olympic Studies at the International Olympic Academy. Over to you, Divya.
Thank you so much, Surbhi. Player management is a key factor that has come a long way in terms of having a professional structure and education that is essential for the growth of the football industry. In Southeast Asia, there is a high scope for creating a legal framework that oversees all the legal matters related to football, including contracts, salaries, brand endorsements, and grievances that players may face in their career. Sports law is a vital cog in the wheel when it comes to creating a robust football ecosystem that is devoid of player disputes and conflicts with the clubs and other stakeholders in the football industry. This session will focus on understanding the key attributes of player management and how it can influence South Asian football to have a more structured legal framework formalized by different federations that will remain a blueprint for carrying out all the activities within the legal. So now I will be introducing all the panelists. First, we have Mr. Jamie Camberling, who is a highly experienced legal expert with extensive knowledge of all FIFA regulations and processes. He specializes in party representation in front of decision-making bodies of International Sports Federation as well as in front of Court of Arbitration for Sport. Then we have Mr. Deep Ray, who is an experienced sports lawyer focused on dispute resolution and transactional work. He is currently the founding member at Sensato Sports Law based in Barcelona, Spain. He provides legal advice to athletes, coaches, agents, clubs, sports management firms from around the world on matters pertaining to inter alia transfers, employment related issues, training compensation, solidarity, and disciplinary matters. Next, we have Ms. Apurvi Jha. Next, we have Ms. Apurvi Jha, who is an experienced sports law professional who is currently working as Assistant Dean and Lecturer at Jindal Global, Jindal Global Law School and is also the Global Ambassador of ISDE. She is working in the international sports law industry since 2018 and has been acting as an international sports dispute advisory to her clients, mainly from the football law world. Last but not the least, we have with us Mr. Anuj Kichlu, who is the CEO of Best of You India, which is part of global agency Best of You, which is based in Madrid. They represent many players and ex-players such as Casimiro and Sabi Alonso. He is also the president of the Asian Division of Professional Football Agents Association. Now, let us start our discussion with these renowned experts to get the best insights in the area of player management and sports law. So, my first question is to Mr. Deep Ray. Firstly, in terms of rights, please elaborate what are the rights of a football players?
Hi, Divya. Thank you for the introduction. A very warm welcome to my fellow panelists. So, Divya, of course, this is when we talk about rights of football players. It's a very vast topic. I'll keep talking about it, and everyone will doze off, and I'll keep talking, I suppose. So, I'm going to focus on rights of football players vis-a-vis employers, that is, football clubs. So, I just touched upon a few fundamental rights that employees or more specifically football players have. So first and foremost, of course, the most important right of any employee or service provider is to be remunerated on time. In this regard, you'll see that FIFA and also national football associations have certain specific provisions. For instance, if a player's salary remains unpaid for a period of more than 30 days, the player may have the right to initiate proceedings against the defaulting party. Or say if a player's salary remains unpaid for a period of more than 2 months after providing due notice, a player may have the right to even terminate the employment contract. Okay, so that is again very, very important. It's very basic but a fundamental right. Apart from that, we can talk about image rights. So image rights, just to give the attendees some idea, image rights are, say, a player's name, autograph, likeness, image, whatever has some commercial values, which can be used for endorsements and such. So especially players who are established and are like considered to be a brand by themselves, it becomes a very important part of their employment contract. So athletes tend to negotiate, a fee for their image rights. That is very frequently seen in football. Apart from that, some of the issues regarding which we see a lot of disputes. One such issue is, say, for example, a player has the right to train with the squad and to compete with their fellow teammates. What we see very often is that when there's a dispute between a player and a club, sometimes club exclude players from training sessions or even do not allow them to enter the training ground. That can be considered to be a breach of a player's rights and can, again, depending on the circumstances and the facts of the matter, allow a player to terminate the contract and take legal action against the employer. Apart from that, there are several contractual rights, of course, which are generally laid down in the employment contract itself, which could include, right to accommodation, healthcare. That's, of course, a very important factor because players are prone to getting injured. In many jurisdictions, it is compulsory for an employer to obtain health insurance and social security for their employees, and football players are employees. But of course, it tends to vary from country to country. Again, several rights are stipulated in the employment contract itself. Like I said, it can include accommodation and transport, etc. So again, the employment contract forms a very, very important document when we talk about the relationship between a player and an employer. That is generally which tends to be a club.
Thank you so much, Deep. So, of course, players' rights are important and it's one of the fundamental aspects for any professional player. So, moving on, my next question is to Mr. Jamie Camberling. Once the rights are being violated, what is the method a professional player should adopt? What do you think about it?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Ilya, for your question, and thank you for the introduction. And again, I want to thank also the organizers of the Global Soccer Conclave for their invitation and the great organization. It's an honor being here, and addressing your question, Divya, it's always important for any player that sees his rights being violated to still continue to act always in good faith, and to the extent possible to continue complying with his own obligations. I will follow a bit the line of thought of what Deep was mentioning about employment violations, which is probably, or employment, let's say, relationships, which is where our mind goes at first when we're talking about the rights of players. Although some of the advice that I'm giving here or the ideas that I'm sharing apply generally. First, the professional player shouldn't be afraid of asserting his rights, of reminding the counterparty to comply with its own obligations. Normally, let's say if we're talking about an employment dispute, to request the club to comply with the obligations. This is not always easy, obviously. At the end, we're talking about the relationship between an employee and an employer, but still, it is something that the players have to have in mind. The players can and should keep their position, keep a strong position, especially if they if they haven't done anything wrong, especially, and if they can assert such a position, and they must keep a respectful attitude at all times towards the counterparty, which we know from experience that this can be very challenging because it could be that the counterparty is not keeping that behavior, but it is always recommendable that nothing can be reproached to the player basis. Then, I personally, as you said before, I represent numerous types of stakeholders within related to sports. And when we have disputes with clients, be it players, be it clubs, we always tend to explore the possibility of negotiating and to the extent possible, avoiding a dispute and avoiding litigation, which can be more costly, which can be more lengthy. And this sometimes it's possible, sometimes it's not. It depends a lot on the relationship between both parties. If there's a problem between two parties, between the player and the club, normally a first phase of negotiations will always take place. Sometimes because both parties want to try to solve the issue genuinely before going to a court. Sometimes because the regulations or the law requires this first phase of negotiations before you can actually go to litigation. So in this last scenario, normally both parties will just have fixed positions. They will approach each other as if they were really negotiating with no willingness to consider anything. And then this is something that usually happens, and obviously this leads to the litigation procedure. The truth is that sometimes the best solution possible and the fastest solution will be a negotiation, but obviously both parties need to want that. And it's sometimes hard to tell this to a client, especially when they have come and with the heat of the moment, they don't, they are fixated on trying to get something out of the other party and they don't want to concede. But as a lawyer, our task is basically to inform the client, in this case, in this example I was talking about a player, of all the potential scenarios at his disposal, so that he can take an informed decision. It's not the lawyer who takes the decision; it's the client. And we've seen numerous cases in which a player and the club had an initial relationship that was deteriorating little by little. This led to a confrontation, which obviously made it impossible to settle amicably. And then we were led into litigation, which is also a viable solution. It's also a good solution if there is no potential negotiation or settlement. And if this is the road to be taken, it is important for a player to be aware of the possible courts, if there's more than one, where this procedure can be taken to. And before going any of those roads, the player should also have the advice of someone that knows the procedure, that can assess also to the extent possible the chances of success. Because you certainly don't want to start a litigation and then find out sometime later that basically your position will not be supported by a court of law.
Thank you so much. So overall methods are quite dynamic in nature, and plus it also varies from country to country. But the underlying principles of the player rights, that remains the same. So moving on, my next question is to Ms. Apurvi Jha. How important is dispute resolution through effective communication, and what club officials should always ensure?
Okay, hi everybody in the panel. Really nice to see you all here. And thank you so much to GSC for organizing this amazing event. So today I am here to talk about communication, which Jamie has pretty much covered, I would say, and I was concerned that we will be overlapping our talk, considering communication is one of the key and starting aspects with respect to dispute resolution in football. See, when we are talking about football contracts, we need to look at football contracts from the perspective of contract for service. They're more towards having equal rights and obligations towards both the parties than having the employer understanding the nature of the labor contract in the sense of a more master and a servant. So it's different. We would relate the nature of football contracts with celebrity contracts to an extent, I would say, but they are very limited because only the cream of football players are actually the top players. Mostly we are talking about mid-level players, which are the majority. Now, communication is key because it is always going to be the starting point. Like many rights that the players have, for example, the right to terminate the contract if in case they are not paid salaries for more than 30 days. The first thing that the court or FIFA would look at particularly is going to be if there have been notifications sent to the club by the player. So these are essentially some aspects that I would say fall under the ambit of sports specificity. sports in itself have a very unique nature of functioning, and we have to consider those aspects. For example, the obligations for players would be to be coming and participating in training sessions for a particular amount of time, or for example, they have to make certain number of appearances on behalf of the club publicly to the media, or in case of big players, their name, their image rights are involved, which also includes a number of posts on Instagram and other social media OTT platforms that these big players are supposed to do on behalf of the club. So these are all obligations which are quite unique, and you would not find it in general labor contracts, which is why we should treat sports, in particular football teams, as teams, which is as a family. So whenever there are communications, you would always, as a player or a club, have an upper hand with respect to a dispute resolution. The first instance is always going to be that FIFA will ask for any notifications that are sent, irrespective of the dispute. And mind you, the disputes would always involve at the end the termination of the contract in itself. And that is why at the end of the day, it is always requested, even as when I used to work in a Brazilian football firm, most of the times the kind of cases that we dealt with were dispute resolution, typically involving overdue salaries, or sometimes the rights of the athletes have been infringed in the sense of international human rights or norms have been infringed. So the clubs are required to also keep that in mind, that when there are international transactions involved, your local national laws might be different from the nationality from where the player is coming. So they have to make sure that if there are certain laws that cannot be mended or changed for in favor of the athlete should be made aware of it clearly. Similarly, communication is important because drafting contracts involve a lot of negotiations. It's not a one-day job. It takes a lot of negotiation. Sometimes agents are also involved. Sometimes an agent is representing both the parties. Sometimes two agents are representing each party. They might be seeking compensation on their end. Sometimes there are players the club requires to be also able to be loaned further to a third player. And all of these clauses are unique to football, I would say. And sports specificity is one aspect that covers all of it. So at the end of the day, it is the communication, because clarity when it comes to mid-level players is not there. Every athlete who is transferred to, especially in international transactions, might not be aware of their rights. Sometimes athletes know that, yes, their right is to able to get away of the contract if in case 30 or more days of salaries are not paid. But what they forget to know is that they still have to send notifications. And if there are no responses from the club side, then you see the aspect of goodwill. Why? Because at the end of the day, these are not servant master relationships. These are relationships where you have equal rights given to both parties. So if the club is being aware of a problem, vice versa, the club has made aware of a problem to the player, they have to communicate it. The communication is always being put on record by FIFA proceedings, and it has been one of the key evidentiary aspects with respect to termination, in particular in football transactions. Now, the other thing that I wanted to talk about was with respect to what clubs could do. Now, what are the clubs' responsibilities when they are trying to sort of avoid dispute resolution? They should make sure that their athletes are adhering to the obligations that they are required to. Otherwise, they should make sure that they have an internal dispute resolution mechanism if in case athletes are involved in some or the other activities which are kind of in violation of their contract in itself. For example, they are creating a ruckus. So these are all disciplinary matters, let alone to be dealt with by the club internally. So they should have all of these things very clear-cut and transparent, because the more the transparent you keep the transaction and relationship, the easier it will be for you to get an upper hand when your case reaches to FIFA. So that's all pretty much that I wanted to talk about today. And I hope that there has been some new information that I added to what Deep and Jaime said. So thank you so much, GSC.
Thanks, Apurvi. So yes, the club officials, we can say that they're accountable for ensuring that there are no conflict of interest, which would actually lead to their better legal framework. So my next question is to Mr. Anuj Kichlu. As a football intermediary, what are your roles and how the negotiation process should be handled by professional players?
Thanks, Divya. Firstly, pleasure to be on this talk show with Jamie, Deep, and Purvi. Thank you for having me here. In terms of negotiating between players and clubs, there are different types of intermediaries. You can represent clubs, you can represent players, you can represent both parties. We obviously as a company represent both, but I talk more on the player side of it because I think that's more adequate. So generally, when you are negotiating, you can see a club is like an institution. So they'll always be better equipped to bargain better, have more knowledge, have more experience. A player is normally an individual or a family. So it's normally an individual or a family against an institution which has been there for many years. So for a player's point of view, you have to keep in mind in your career, you probably sign about between 4 to 6 major contracts. I think early on is scouting. So you go into academies at the age of 16, 17, you get your first opportunity into the professional field. So at 17, you're probably going to sign between a 3 to 5 year contract, depending on the country you're from and what kind of club you play for. There'll be players who are moving from bigger club academies to smaller teams. There'll be players who are moving from smaller academies to really big teams. So it really depends. I mean, like the best clubs want to hold on to the best players. They'll probably give them the best contracts. In that case, it's probably the easiest negotiation because you know you're already at a good club. You're going to get a good extension. You'll be there for 3-4 years. Your career starts from there, the age of 18 up to about 22 when you start really hitting into your prime. But it's a balance, and it also depends on your position, I guess. So if you're a goalkeeper, it's tougher. If you're a goalkeeper and you're 18 or 19, you're going to come into your team where you'll probably be the third or fourth choice. Then you have to negotiate. Do you have options to leave in case you need to develop? Do you have options to go on loan? There are lots of things to put in over there. Then I think when you start hitting 21, 22, you start hitting, okay, fine, you have played 2-3 years as a professional. Now people need to really make a decision. Are they going to be core players in a big club, or are they not going to make it there? Are they going to be the core players of a slightly smaller club, or are they happy to be a reserve player in a big club? So that's when you negotiate. You have to really be clear with the player in terms of what does he want to do? How does he see his career panning out? Do you have objectives of being in the national team, which everyone wants to be, but is there an opportunity to grow in that club? So I think all the negotiations depend on that, whether you want how many years you want to extend for. Do you want to go to another club? Do you want to have options for loans? Those kind of objectives. Then between 22 to 25, 26, the players hitting peak at a particular club. And then that's the main part of your career comes in, which is like 26 to about 31. At that time, you probably sign your big 5-year deal. So if you're at a particular club, you've been set out there, that club probably wants to keep you for 5 different teams, getting offers, seeing whether you want to stay at that club for 1 million or go to another club for 5 million. And then that's where all the dynamics of negotiation really comes in. And I think that's where an agent has to advise a player less, and it becomes more of a financial decision for them and a family decision. So by then you see people might be having families, might be starting to settle down. They might want to be in a particular country, might want to be in a particular place. They might prefer a particular city, particular language. So all these kind of factors come in. So depending on that, you search for an adequate club. And then by the time the player hits 31, 32, that's when he probably wants to sign for 5 years and continue in the same club if he's set over there, or look for a new option. But the club probably thinks, oh, he's 32, 33, let's look at 1 year, 2 years at a time. So that's when you negotiate and you see what's the best balance between a player and the club. And then by the time the player is 34, 35, 36, when he's coming towards the end of the career, obviously it's different for different players. But when he's coming to the end of the career, if you start thinking about coaching, future after football, which club is good for that, which city is good for him to develop more in terms of off the field and different aspects. So negotiating the contract obviously is financial, it's family, it's seeing the best option for the players. But at the same time, I think it depends on the position of the player, the stage of the player is in his career, whether he's still up for national team selection, whether he thinks he's past that prime. All these kind of objectives come in. I guess it's a balance, because for an agent, you're balancing between a club and a player. So you have to see both aspects of it. But I just feel that the players need more representation because they're individuals and they have the experience only of themselves. So they want someone to count on. So an agent might have an experience of 10, 15, 20 years. The player has experience when he starts his career of 1 year of knowledge compared to a club which has 60, 70 years of knowledge. So I think it's just more important that agents can represent players like that. And obviously it's being clear with the players what you see for them and what they want out of it. What's their goal out of the particular club, out of a particular contract. It might be completely financial in some cases. It might be someone from a really poor background who thinks that stay in one club, settle your career there, set your family there, educate yourself off the field. So it depends on that as well. Yeah, so that's there. And then I still think that players put themselves at the forefront a bit too much sometimes in negotiations, and that's when it gets a bit ugly. So they should just leave the agents to handle it. So sometimes when you see big transfers, you see players who want to leave a particular club. Obviously, everyone's not going to be in one club their whole career. So if you go from a championship to a Premier League or a League One to a League Two to League One club, there will be pressure from a new club to join. There will be pressure from you to leave a club. But then when you put yourself at the forefront, you get involved in social media and talking to the fans and in abuse from people, then it just becomes an ugly kind of scene. So I think the players should just put the agent at the forefront, leave everything behind the scenes, and let them handle it and just see a smooth transition. Because end of the day, people will do what's best for them. I mean, both clubs will do what's best for them. There'll only be about 10, 15 clubs in the world who will not let their players go. They'll be happy to hold on to the best players at any cost, but there'll be 2,000 clubs out there who are happy to sell their players. So it's just about reaching the right cause for the player, the right cause for the club, the right transfer fee, and then letting the player move on in a very a harmonious and very well managed manner, I think. Yeah, so that's, I think, negotiating with clubs is about that.
Thank you so much, Anuj. So, of course, negotiation is never easy, but it's a player's journey and experience of working with clubs that makes him highly skilled and efficient in this aspect. So, my next question is to Mr. Jamie. Violation of any regulation or rule, say doping violation, how is it to be handled?
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you very much, Divya, for this question. It's definitely a very interesting one, but it's also a very wide one. I will try to address, or at least provide some general guidance that is normally applicable to all disciplinary cases, because the exact way forward depends very much on the type of infringement that the player is being charged with. But first, I think something that applies generally to everyone is to all clubs, especially if you're talking about football, is to be preventive, to try to prevent issues. And how can this be done? Well, clubs, in my opinion, and it's a very good practice, should conduct the necessary training to its players, provide the necessary education and the necessary tools to avoid the risk of committing a disciplinary infraction, being anti-doping or being of any other sort. This is something that it's good for clubs to do. Obviously, the players have the obligation to know the legal framework in which they're operating, but the clubs could reduce the risk of disciplinary violations if they take this measure. Now, once an infringement has been committed, or at least once the player is being charged with an infringement, it's very important to be familiarized with the type of case and the type of procedure that you're looking at. Normally, this can be done by reaching out to a lawyer, obviously, and this can be seen as a bit of a self-serving advice from my side, since I'm a lawyer myself. But the reality is that you cannot imagine the amount of cases that I've seen and that we've seen here at the law firm, in which a player or a club ignore maybe or don't take seriously a charge for a disciplinary rule violation, and then it's only once they have been sanctioned, once they have a decision from the competent body, that the person, the player, the club start looking for help. So maybe at this time it's a bit late, maybe it's not the best moment. So the advice is to always try to get someone that knows what's going on. This doesn't have to be necessarily an external lawyer. This can be someone from internally from the club. If obviously we're talking about a player being charged with an infringement, he might want to go with someone from the club if the interest of the club and the player are aligned. So it's important to take into account. Now, what is also very important is to understand what the player is actually facing. So I'm talking about what type of sanction he's facing, the type of procedure that we have to follow, how long can this procedure take, and especially what can the player do or not do during the procedure. For instance, if we're talking about anti-doping rule violation, so a doping case basically, there could be potentially a provisional measure, provisional suspension imposed. During that time, the player should not train with the club, should not compete. There are very strict rules that he has to follow, and it's important that he is guided by someone that knows these things. Because otherwise, well, he could make things worse for him and for the club. So you need someone basically that knows the intricacies of the regulations, the case law potentially, and then if, for example, we're talking about an anti-doping case, and the question was what has to be done, how is it to be handled? When we're talking about an anti-doping case, frequently the first step is try to figure out how the prohibited substance that appeared in a player sample got into his body. And this can be very straightforward. If the player tests for cannabinoids and he smoked something a week ago, then it's quite easy to find out what the substance was or the origin of the substance was. But if we're talking about an inadvertent intake of a substance or a contamination, then this can be quite difficult to find out. And therefore, it's important also in those type of cases to get the best assistance from experts, not just lawyers, but also from the scientific point of view, to try to get to the bottom of the case as soon as possible. So it's always important as a general advice, let's say, to get professionals to assist and to guide the player throughout the procedure. And once these persons are involved in the situation, once these persons are made aware of all the circumstances of the case, then they can define a legal strategy, a defense strategy, so that the player has a bit of certainty of the way forward, and hopefully then a positive result can be achieved.
Thank you so much, Jamie. So there should always be a standard set of regulations which a club should create to ensure that any kind of violation is avoided. So moving on, my next question is open to all. So when we talk about sports, injury of course follows. So the injury and medical cover is important, and how the legal structure presently covers it from Mediclaim point of view. So you all can share your ideas one by one. Jamie, you go first.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Sorry. No, so for how important is it? Well, obviously the injury and medical cover is always very important. How the structure presently covers it depends very much on a case-by-case basis. But obviously, what I can say is that clubs, obviously players should try to have the best coverage possible, but clubs also have to make sure that they do have everything in place. And if they don't have everything in place, they should inform the players so that they can take their own actions from their own side. I think it has to be maybe possibly in line with the topic that Arthur was mentioning about communication between both parties.
Yeah. Should I go? I think.
Yeah.
I think to be fair, I think nowadays clubs are quite good with medical coverage. So obviously FIFA regulates you have to have medical coverage and you have to cover the entire length of contract despite an injury. So there are two aspects. One is the Mediclaim, which is actually looking after the hospital expenses or the surgery or the expenses directly related to the injury, which I think in today's day and age, every club, possibly every club looks at covering. There will be those who sometimes go against the laws, but the players are protected for that. That's one. The second is the player loss of fees, which is the salary that the club misses out on, which they're paying them during their term of injury. And for that, normally clubs, even Southeast Asia and India now, they have insurance companies who cover this is quite a hefty premium. So some clubs are reluctant to pay it, but the ones who do, they have a coverage for that. So if you do lose salary for 3 or 4 months, the players being paid for 3-4 months by recovering, the club can claim that from the insurance company. So the Mediclaim and the loss of player fees are two completely different things, and both of them are normally covered by at least most of the professional clubs. The major concern, I think, is basically players who are finishing contracts. So if someone's on the last 4 months or 6 months or 8 months of a contract and has a major injury, that's where we see a concern in terms of the club will probably treat him at a hospital, probably look after the salary, but he probably face an issue at rehab, because if the player is 30, 31 and he's finishing his contract, he has an injury, he doesn't have a future at the club. That's when a player, I think, really needs to look out for himself in terms of even doing some extra rehab on his own, going to individuals, going to specialists, because that's where you really have to look out for yourself and know that 6 months from now, when you don't have a contract, you've got the best rehab, you're back in the best shape. So that's actually stepping aside from the Mediclaim and the loss of player fees, but looking at the personal characteristics of a player to get back into the game post an injury. So I think those are the 3 main aspects. Most of them, like I said, to be fair, FIFA covers everything nowadays with the clubs, and the clubs have been turning more and more professional. Like between 10 years back and now, even in India has completely changed. Southeast Asia is changing. I think a lot of the clubs are changing, and they do cover everything. Thank you.
Also, what about the right of a player to choose his or her own surgeon? What do you think about that? Does it has any say, or the player's opinion has any value?
See, I think before we jump to this question, there is one thing that also needs to be clarified when we are talking about medical claims, is that clubs would always be inclined on specifying that the injury that we are talking about is a playing injury. Okay, they will sometimes, most cases, make sure that those injuries sustained out of the training sessions, out of some adventurous, shenanigans that the player is going through over the off season, are not going to be covered. So that is an important aspect that the athletes should be aware of, that they are supposed to take care of themselves off season. And in cases when there is a training season, or there is a season, proper playing season going on, that they do not indulge themselves in adventurous activities that can lead to injuries, because those usually would not be covered by the club. They always used to make sure that they imply all of these things in the clause. So they clarify this in the clause in itself.
Yes. Moving on to Mr. Deep now. What do you think about this?
Just to add to what my fellow panelists have said. So what personally the issues I faced, look, when we talk about international player contracts, you can approach FIFA in most cases unless the jurisdiction of FIFA has been excluded. So it's a little more clear, But when we talk about domestic player contracts in many countries, including in India, there can be certain issues, especially in lower divisions. When you talk about the Indian Super League, most clubs do obtain medical insurance for their players, and they have to pay a hefty fee in most occasions because players fall in the high risk category. I think Anuj touched upon it briefly. Especially in lower divisions, there can be issues regarding health insurance. So what we see, firstly, if I use an Indian example, if you look at the second division, which is the I-League, or the third division, I-League second division, the duration of the leagues tend to be very short. And that is also the case with state leagues. Okay. So if a player gets injured, on many occasions, clubs are not very inclined to even pay for the player's treatment. And players in many, many cases are not aware of their rights. I know I have seen many player contracts where even if it's mentioned in the contract that the club is responsible to obtain insurance, it is not happening in practice. Again, I'm not talking about the ISL, but lower divisions. And that is a huge, huge problem. And in many contracts that it's not even mentioned, the whole issue that a club is supposed to pay for a player's insurance. I was reviewing a contract a couple of weeks back, lower division club in India. They actually included a clause according to which if a player got injured and they remained injured for a period of 1 month, the club would have the right to terminate the player's contract. And if that does happen, and we take the matter to the All India Football Federation's Player Status Committee, because we can't go to FIFA, it's a domestic dispute, I'm not sure what's going to happen. So these issues do come up when we talk about health insurance and such. So things are getting better, like Anuj mentioned, but still there are a lot of issues, especially when we talk about lower levels of football.
Thank you so much. So moving on to next question, which is open to all. The bad infrastructure or hygiene is against the rights of players. What is the sports law think on this aspect? We can start one by one.
I can go first again if you want. I think this is one of the basic rights. I think Deep was covering this in this intervention at the very beginning. Healthcare is a basic right for any player and for any club to provide for any player. The same for infrastructure. They have to, any player, in order to be able to develop their job, now we're talking about professionals, has to be given the necessary means to do so. And healthcare and infrastructure are basic elements. Otherwise, a player cannot develop skills and even comply with his contractual obligations. So I think if a club wants, especially a club that wants to attract professional players of a certain level and wants to keep on improving and becoming better and better, it has to ensure that these basic things are covered, because, well, a house has to be built from the foundation, right, not from the roof. And this is part of the foundation of any working relationship, even more so in football.
Also, like, if we can take the example, for example, what happened in Flamengo's training club. 10 of the young amateur players were under fire and eventually died. So eventually Flamengo club, which is one of the biggest clubs in Brazil from Rio, had to pay a handsome amount of money back to at least 9 out of the 10 amateur players. That was because they did not rely to the infrastructural needs that were provided by the government. So they can be held accountable, and mostly these are civil suits. So there'll be a big amount of damages and compensation that would be there too. And on the side, CBF, I think, also mandated for Flamengo club to only start their training clubs once they, fulfill the requirements of the infrastructural needs. When this happened, it was one of the biggest tragedies, because we are talking about young athletes, not in their major years. So the rights of minor athletes are much, much more different from those of professional athletes as well. So we have to keep that in mind. And like I said, this was a local national matter dealt by CBF and the local authorities. But if in case there were minor athletes, in most cases, especially when we're talking about Brazil or countries where you have borders in, miles apart, you wouldn't have international minor athletes playing for your club, playing or participating and training in your club. That would usually happen only in Europe, where you have borders within 50 kilometers, 200 kilometers, adjacent to each other. So in those cases, these are domestic matters and are taken much more seriously, I would say. Because, for example, there was a case that I dealt with which involved heavy violation of human rights, but then the parties were international. So then again, the question of, how are we managing the rights when we're talking about international federations, and how much say do they have over the local authorities? So that is another question demanding another session in itself, I would say. But at this point, yes, it's really important to make sure that the hygiene and the infrastructure needs are made up, because that ways we are not just looking at international rules, but we are also looking at national mandates, which is altogether a different scenario. It doesn't involve arbitration, it is straight up litigation, and it involves a lot of resources utilized during these proceedings and the time in itself.
I think it's like a normal employer-employee relationship. You have to provide a safe environment, healthy environment, good infrastructure to any, whether it's football or normal work. But then obviously that will differ in different countries, like Apurvi said. So you could have a player playing in a Swiss club with everything perfect, and then you could have a player playing in a club in Bangladesh, which he thinks everything is perfect. But then when you have players moving between countries, then the Swiss player comes to Bangladesh and says the 6 guys staying in a room with probably no fire exit at the stadium. So is that a normal standard for them? So I guess it's also the national regulation. At the same time, it's the image of the club which comes in. So sometimes I think fortunately the clubs have got big images, so they have to protect that. So it could be a non-legal aspect, but just pressure from players to improve standards. So you could have players playing on a ground which is muddy with water on it and uneven, which is not acceptable for any level of football in Europe, but it's acceptable in a Southeast Asian smaller country to that, at least to that population. So it's also about adjustment, but it's also about just like, I think sometimes you have to put pressure on that, change the standards, not train on a particular type of ground, have better bathrooms, better facilities, better living standards. So it's obviously debatable and it will fluctuate between countries, but primarily is like any other employer-employee relationship, providing good environment to practice and play.
Yeah, and also I think it ultimately comes down to the regulations and the mandates that are imposed by FIFA and the, confederations on the club licensing. So if you are a club who thinks you have potential to be part of the first division, you at least have to have minimum mandates that are already universally required. So then at the end of the day, there are certain things that you really cannot get yourself out of if you want to play at a certain level. But then again, we are talking about big level players, first division clubs, which are cream of the cream, and then second division, lower. The more lower we go down, the financial constraints play a big part. And I think that the financial constraints are the reason why not all clubs can become first division clubs to begin with.
Yeah, and if I may add something to what we just mentioned, it is true that it's the regulators that have to impose these kind of issues or these kind of matters on the clubs. Normally, more than FIFA, probably it's when we're talking about these lower level clubs and about club licensing, it probably should be confederations and national associations. Should be the ones with strong rules that guarantee that these minimum elements are being respected, right? And then also referring to the example that Apurvi was mentioning, I myself also dealt with when I worked at FIFA with a case of international transfer of minors, minors that were all coming from Africa to Southeast Asia, actually, and there, aside from the fact that this amounted almost to child trafficking, but the conditions of the minors in the club after very, very long hours of traveling, then they were promised salaries that obviously were never respected and they were not paid. And on top of that, they were left in conditions that were terrible, sharing rooms that were not even rooms because there were no beds to stay on and so on. So these were things and elements that, in addition to already what constitutes a very harsh infringement of the regulations, which is not respecting the prohibition on international transfer of minors, but on top of that, subjecting those minors to those terrible healthcare and sanitary conditions was an aggravating circumstance when the case was being evaluated and decided. So here you see also another example of how these elements are considered as basic, and not respecting them can actually make things worse for any potential civil claim, as Apurvi was mentioning, or even a disciplinary violation that has something to do with healthcare, with infrastructure.
Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing your insights. Now, moving on, my next question is to Mr. Anuj. So, what is the present rule position once an Indian player wants to play abroad? Is it an uphill task? Because sometimes the player says that my team doesn't play good, but I played good. So, is it an uphill task when a player wants to play abroad?
Yeah, I think playing abroad for an Indian is very, very challenging. Obviously, the first two things, I've done this myself. I've placed, I think, 2 Indian males abroad and 3 Indian females abroad. So 5 Indian players have played professionally abroad in the last 3-4 years, and that's been it. In fact, 2 girls just joined yesterday in a club, Dinamo Zagreb in Croatia. But the first thing when you go to any foreign club and you speak to them, it's like the Indian ranking is 100 plus for men, 50 plus for women, and they've got 45 countries ahead of that in Europe itself. So it's obviously a challenge for a club to even look at a player beyond a 60, 79 country. But at the same time, I think they do have players coming in from, like in Europe, in Spain and England, there are players coming in sometimes from South Africa, sometimes from Rwanda, who are not really like very high ranking countries. They may be 60, 70, 80. And they'll have quite a few players from those countries moving. But I think the opportunities for them in their countries are more limited. So they're actually more keen and eager to go at a young age. In India also, the salaries are quite high for young players. I think the players between the age of 18 and 22 earn quite well. So sometimes it's a temptation just to stay in the country, earn big salaries. I think it's like my target myself has been to push these players out of the country and get them playing in another league, even if it's for a very low amount to get more exposure. And some do it, some don't do it, some need the money. So it's a different thing about balancing it. But there are lots of aspects, and the aspects in Europe about obviously visas. In terms of England, has a lot of Indian population, so they like Indian players because they'd probably play in the lower divisions in League One and League Two. But there are issues with work permits there, so Indians don't qualify for the work permits, so they can't play professional there. There are several countries in Europe who have EU passport restrictions, who have maximum 2 or 3 non-EU players who can play. So they'd rather use that spot for a South American, African top talent. And then there are countries who have minimum salaries. So that even though Indian would be willing to come on a lower salary, they have a minimum 200, 300, I think Netherlands has a 350,000 euro minimum salary, which probably no Indian player will qualify for the next 5-10 years. So the challenges with visas, I mean, the challenges with the ranking and the level of football, but even if you beat those challenges, the challenges with visas and getting them employment. So it's a dual challenge. And again, language challenges where I think some players don't come from an English speaking background. So for them, English might be a second or even third language. And then for some other countries, English is their second language. So it's a big communication gap as well. So it's challenging. It's challenging, but we are seeing players slowly moving out, world's becoming more global. Hopefully, if you get 2, 3, 4 players out of India every year, I think that will be a good start.
Thank you so much. So my next question is open to all as we're running short of time. So the sponsors are also using the players through contractual terms. Mostly they become the logo sponsor of club and using athletes and club players as asset. So do you think the players are getting their rights in this scenario? It's open to all. Anyone can answer.
Yeah, so I'll be very brief. So generally, I think I briefly mentioned this beginning. So for players who are more established, of course, they have some brand value, which is not the case for every football players. I mean, only the top football players provide value in terms of endorsements and all to clubs. So such players tend to negotiate a separate image rights deal with their employers, which is separate for the salaries that they receive for playing football. So that is generally speaking again taken care of. And for young players who are just starting off, they don't really have much bargaining power with clubs. So they have the obligation to appear for endorsement deals and such. So there's not much not much power because of the lack of bargaining power. But again, for established players, this does form a huge part of their remuneration which they receive from clubs.
Yeah, I think the most important aspect that comes in mind is bad lawyering in these circumstances in terms of when we are talking about new players. Because the ones who are experienced players already know their worth and they will be pretty much using the image right clauses that they have been using for the last couple of years at least. But when we're talking about those players who have recently attained a certain level of recognition, let's talk about those right now. So the problem that arises is that first, the player in itself is not aware of their worth. Then when we are talking about clubs, the clubs have certain very basic and common clauses applicable to all of the team's players, which involves a certain number of public, like I said in my previous talk, like certain level of public, displays when it comes to news articles or be it advertising purposes. And these are some things which are common for and applicable to all the team players. Now, over and above these clauses comes those special clauses where we are talking about exploitation of specific rights of big names. Now, again, like I already mentioned, it's a very rarest of the rare case, but should be also discussed. That is that when we're talking about popular names, we have to treat them like celebrities, which means that image rights when they are playing for FIFA will differ from when they are participating and representing their own club. Because then there are certain clauses within FIFA which would mandate their image rights to be used for the purposes of FIFA's advertisement. Now, all of these things are some clauses that are specific and would be negotiated. Similarly, boot contracts are something which is different in football. So football shoes are having a separate sponsorship agreement in itself, and that particularly depends on the player's choice. The most comfortable shoe that he wants to play in should be the choice of the shoe that they want to wear throughout the season. So again, that would be different from the basic norm of using the same sponsored clothes, for example, during the matches. So there are, again, very, very minute, but very, different and specific intricacies when it comes to image rights. And they will differ from each player from another, depending on A, their level of playing, B, the number of fan and following that they have overall. So we have to just be mindful of this when we're negotiating. So first thing that the lawyer needs to know is the worth of their own player, or the agent are supposed to know the worth of the player in itself. That would come out of either fan following, the number of followers they have on social media, etc., or the number of advertisements, or the number of playing achievements that they have achieved throughout their seasons. And keeping all of these in mind, there should be negotiations that usually run.
Yeah, I fully agree. And if I may add something, when also like it's very much linked to the negotiation, because we've seen also when we have contractual disputes, mainly employment-related disputes, that sometimes image rights agreements can actually be considered as a means of providing an undercover salary for whatever reason, maybe tax-wise, maybe concerning salary caps that apply nationally, or so on. And therefore, it's important also for everyone to be aware of this risk, which depends very much on the specific negotiation and the specific contractual construction that has been put or has been set up in that case, because if not, this can bring important surprises if there's a dispute and the matter has to be submitted, for example, to the bodies of FIFA or at national level, and these are considered to be salaries, then we potentially are talking about much higher figures than what the parties initially thought, right? So it can be a very relevant aspect too.
Thank you so much, sir. So as there is no time, I would like to cut this short, and thanks everyone for the lovely session. Over to you, Surbhi.
Thank you so much, Divya. I might say it was a very knowledgeable and insightful session. Taking this opportunity to thank all our esteemed panelists, JM, Anuj, Apurvi, and Deep, for their insightful contribution to this session. Thank you so much. We are coming back with another session which is on marketing and sponsorship strategies, which will start very shortly.